Welcome to Who Shaves the Barber, a weekly podcast where we explore paradoxes, thought experiments, and other pointless problems. I'm William Nava. This is the second half of my interview with Michael Hicks. During the first half, we discussed broad questions about what thoughts are. For this second half, we discussed the narrower topic of thoughts about hallucinations and fictional entities. Though it's possible to follow this second half without having heard the first, I do recommend listening to the first part to grasp the full context of this discussion. As always, it can be found at williamnava.com. And now, on to the interview. You've written about environment dependence. Can you say a little bit about what that is?
Sure. So that was a phrase I used in my dissertation. I like it. I'm not sure how. I was running together a few things that I would now want to be more careful about keeping separate. But it was supposed to be an extension and a generalization of Gareth Evans's thesis of object dependence. And the idea comes back to this earlier claim that I made a moment ago, that I can be mistaken as to whether I am so much as enjoying a thought. And so Evans's idea is, for instance, that in the context of an existential hallucination, when you take it that there is a glass over there that you're looking at, but in fact you're hallucinating and there is no glass, and you say, I wonder if that glass is heavy. This is an example Lucy O'Brien gives. I wonder if that glass is heavy, or I suppose that, let's suppose that glass is heavy. Then, if so, if I were to ding it like this, it wouldn't fall over. O'Brien thinks it's quite clear that there's a coherent thought content that is going on there that explains what you're doing. Evans says, actually, no. The mere fact that you think that you're thinking coherently about that glass doesn't show that you are. In order for you to be thinking coherently about that glass, there has to be a glass there that is controlling your thinking in a way that nothing is, because you're hallucinating. And what I want to claim is that the kind of fragility Evans is pointing at to singular thought contents, in fact, infects all of our thinking. That whenever we are thinking at all, we are doing something that could, in principle, be undermined in the way that Evans imagines singular thinking could, in principle, be undermined. So that was what I meant. And so my use of the word environment was sort of an unhappy way, I think, now, of trying to pick out the idea that all of our thinking, not just our thinking about specific objects in the environment, but all of our thinking involves the world in which we think about, in the world in which the thinking occurs and about which the thinking concerns. And so environment was intended to pick out the rest of it. But I think that it has other implications that are misleading, and that it might have even misled me in some ways in my earlier work. So I'm not as happy now with the word environment, but I wasn't really happy with it at the time either, and I just didn't have a better word for it. But the idea is supposed to be that all of our thought content involves us going out on a certain kind of limb, in a way that Evans thought that our use of singular terms involves us going out on a certain limb. Does that answer that question?
Yeah. So does that mean then that you're committed, certainly at least, to Evans's claim that there actually is no thought there? Right. So let me ask you this. Let's say that I am with a friend, and we have a shared hallucination.
So what does that mean? It's interesting how quickly people go to shared hallucination. I like this. So what is a shared hallucination? Because I can think of a couple different things it might mean.
Sure. So I think there's two ways I could think to answer the question, and I think that they're actually rather different.
Okay.
One of them is like we both took a hallucinogenic drug, and we're now having what seemed to us to be like similar or compatible hallucinations. This is a thing that like there's, has been reported.
Right.
Something else I think a bit easier to imagine and sort of less involves like weird empirical questions of what what kind of hallucinogenic experiences there are, is like, somebody's actually playing a trick on us. Somebody has like actually set up the room to make it look like there's a glass over there. And so we're both tricked in the same way,
right. Sure.
To thinking that there's a glass over there.
Sure. There's a third example, or there's a third possibility too, which I think is important to remember, which is that you could both, in a certain sense, be aware that you're hallucinating and decide implicitly, probably, to throw yourself into a world of shared hallucination. Mm-hmm. You could, so to speak, be playing a game. Mm-hmm. And obviously, we can play a game with a shared invented focus. Like, siblings can play a game where they're hiding from the monster, and it's the monster that they're hiding from. There's no monster, but there can be certain rules to the game, in virtue of which it is the monster that they are hiding from, right?
Sure. So the floor is lava is my favorite.
What's that?
The floor is lava is my favorite of these types of games. Which
sure, yeah, and people talk about mud pies as a it's a part of the rule of the game, that the tree stump is an oven, and if you put the mud on the tree. Yeah, anyway, so there are familiar imaginative games, and they can be existentially creative. That is to say, they can make it so that in some sense there are more things than there are. And so that's the line of thought that led me into thinking about fiction, which is something that you had said you wanted to ask me about later. So I'll put that one aside. But I just wanted to flag that as a phenomenological possibility for some of the things that people mean when they talk about shared hallucination, is that, of course, we could throw ourselves into a game that is inspired in some way by the hallucinations we're having because of our drug. All right, so then there's, putting that one aside, then there's two other cases. So the one case, we could both be having very similar hallucinations, as you said. This is an interesting one. So, because I take it that, for instance, so Frege has this example of the lime tree, that's the hallucinated lime tree. And one of the things that Frege wants to insist is that we're not talking about the second. So Frege points out, in effect, that when I'm hallucinating a lime tree, I have, just as when I'm seeing a lime tree, I have a second realm entity, a lime tree image, a lime tree idea, somehow in view. And according to Frege, it would be a disaster to think that in the good case, where I'm actually seeing a lime tree, and I talk about that lime tree, that all I'm ever doing is talking about my idea of a lime tree. Frege takes it that, on the contrary, I am talking about that lime tree itself. And he famously says that in the hallucination case, similarly, somebody who's deceived by a hallucination is not talking about the hallucination, right? They're talking about the lime tree. They're trying to talk about that lime tree itself. And he famously says they've slid into fiction without knowing it. It's hard to know what exactly it means to slide into fiction without knowing it. I would like to claim, Evans claims, that the best way to understand this is as saying that they are thinking what Frege elsewhere calls mock thoughts, not real thoughts at all, but they don't realize it. Now, I think that mock thought is itself an unhappy phrase, and many people have said that Evans makes too much of it. They're probably right. But Evans's idea is a helpful one here, because it suggests that what is happening here is that the subject thinks he's doing something that he's not doing. And what I want to claim is that what he thinks he's doing and is not doing is thinking about that lime tree. All right, so, but anyway, putting that aside for a second, one thing, whether I am a victim of the hallucination or not, I can think about my hallucinated lime tree in some sense. So forget being a victim for a second. Let me just be having a hallucination, but be fully aware of it. So I know that, it's my room. I know there's no lime tree over there, right? Take the start. Crazy, it looks like there's a lime tree. And then you could be sitting beside me and you could say, crazy, it looks like there's a lime tree over there for me too, right? And then I could say, well, my lime tree has 6 leaves on the second branch. How about yours? And you could say, my lime tree has 7 leaves on the second branch, and we can compare our very similar hallucinations. Well, so now if we are deceived about whether our hallucinations are hallucinations, we might think that in addition to having very similar second realm ideas, we are having those in virtue of some first realm object. We're totally mistaken about that. And I think that what I have just done will explain why it is that we think we can communicate about the tree. We can't communicate about the tree. There's no tree to communicate about. The reason why we might not notice it is if our hallucinations are very similar, right? So if we have very similar hallucinations and we're both totally taken in by them, we might not realize that we're talking past one another. We might not realize that what we're saying is something that cannot literally be understood because it feels to us like we're understanding one another. And it'll only stop feeling that way when one or the other of us realizes that there's no damn tree, at which point, we will no longer be able to make sense. If I realize there's no tree, I might think to myself, oh boy, is William seeing something that I'm not? Is he talking about some other tree? Or did he take the hallucinogenic drug too? Right? So that case is something to be explained. We can explain why it looks in that idiosyncratic case like there's understanding. But notice that you have to do a fair amount of stage setting before you can even get sort of extended bits of apparent understanding, right? If your hallucination is of a dog where mine is of a tree, we're not even going to have the appearance of understanding one another until, again, we realize that we're just talking about our hallucinations and not about real objects over there. So then the other version of a shared hallucination you mentioned was the case that might better be thought of as like an optical illusion, right? So we can both, in the context of an optical illusion, recognize things like that the stick looks bent in the water. It looks like there's a bent stick over there, we say, when in fact what there is a stick in water, right? Supposedly when you stick it, right, anyway, So, but I don't see how hallucination is special for that. In fact, I think it would be a mistake to conflate hallucination and illusion. And in the case of why it is that optical illusions work the way they do, the right thing to do is to look into the nature of optics and to explain why it is that, for instance, straight sticks look bent in water, and because they look bent to everybody. As John Austin says, do you think that a straight stick jolly well has to look straight at all times and places? Of course not. The way a straight stick is supposed to look when you put it in water is bent. So if you didn't see it as bent, you'd be seeing it wrong. And the way that optical illusions work is precisely by exploiting the fact that things from different perspectives and in weird perspectives look ways that we don't expect. But that's how they're supposed to look. That's why optical illusions can be designed with such success. Of course, you have to constrain the victims of the optical illusion. If you want to make it an illusion, you have to constrain them to particular perspectives. But once you've done that, then you can get people taken in. And if it's successful, then they ought to be taken in. If they don't know.
So that makes sense. I guess the reason I mentioned the optical illusion is in the case. So in the case of the bent stick, there's no real problem. Like if we both look at the stick and it looks bent, and we say, "Hey, look, the stick there is bent," then we're both saying something meaningful that I guess is wrong because the stick is not really bent.
Right. Sure.
But I'm talking about a case of an optical illusion where the illusion is the appearance of an object that actually doesn't exist at all. Mm-hmm. Would you say that for that the answer is, again, just that we think we're understanding each other, but in fact we're not?
Right. That's right. That's what I have to say. And and so the question would be, is there anything wrong with that? Again, what we'll be able to do is we'll be able to give a very good explanation of why it looks like we are, and why we feel like we're understanding one another. And the question, and so one of the ways you might press by asking, what more than that kind of explanation do you ever want? Right? And this is where the idea that there is such a thing as successfully understanding one another takes on a controversial hue. I claim that there is something more than being able to explain why it feels like we understand one another sometimes. I claim that there is such a thing as thinking definite things, that we do, so to speak, reach out to the world in thought sometimes. And that means that I have to sharply distinguish the case where we actually understand one another from the cases in which the best we can hope for is explaining why it seems like we understand one another, or explaining why it seemed like to that guy like that was a coherent thing to say there. And so that's a very sharp difference.
I almost want to reach to Russell's take on definite descriptions here, which I have not generally personally been that favorable to, but I guess what we're talking about really is how to deal with thoughts in the cases of reference failure, right? And Russell famously says that when we talk about some object, we kind of implicitly say there is this object, right? So that allows cases of reference failure to come out as false, right? Why not do something like this in the case of thoughts, where rather than not actually having thoughts, we are having a thought, they're both just incorrect thoughts, positing an object that's not there?
The question, so there's a sort of narrow question, there's a narrow thing I can say in response to that, and then there's that leaves a broad question, like why do I want to make the much more radical claim? So but the narrow thing that I want to say is this, and this is what Evans says, and I think that this is at least right. He wants to say, look, there is something we can do, or we can try to do, that goes beyond what Russell allows for, which is that we can go out on a limb. So where the picture I'm laying out is one that is, from Evans's perspective at least, Russellian in a broad sense. That is to say, it relies on the idea, on Russell's idea, that singular thought involves a direct cognitive relationship with its object. Now, one of the reasons, there's lots of controversies about how exactly to read Russell, but one of the reasons it seems as if Russell denies that we can have a direct cognitive relationship with ordinary objects is because of the possibility of reference failure. Russell finds the possibility of, so Russell basically acknowledges that if you could have a direct cognitive relationship with an ordinary object, then there would be circumstances in which you would think you were having a direct cognitive relationship with an ordinary object and you weren't, and so you would think you were having a thought but weren't. And Russell says that's totally incoherent, so obviously we can't have direct cognitive relationships with ordinary objects. Evans suggests that, on the other hand, you could try, and we do try. We do take ourselves to actually concern ourselves directly with objects, not just with objects under some description or other. We take ourselves to go out on this limb. As Frege says, by the step with which I secure a world for myself, I expose myself to the risk of error. But securing a world requires doing something that goes beyond the domain of certainty that Russell wants to keep our knowledge of our cognitive contents in. And so the idea I have, so the weaker claim is we can go beyond, or try to go beyond that domain of subjective certainty. We can try to concern ourselves with the world directly, so to speak. And that exposes us to the risk of error. And so a kind of paranoid concern about denying the possibility of that sort of error by, for instance, introducing the machinery of Russellian descriptions throughout the claim here. That sort of paranoid concern would yield the conclusion that we can't try to concern ourselves directly with objects. And that seems to me to be unfortunate, because I think that we do, in fact, concern ourselves with the world directly. So one response is to say, look, surprisingly, perhaps, the line of thought you just presented on Russell's behalf is one that limits our cognitive abilities. It limits us from being able to really reach out in a way that would depend on the presence of the object for success. In the way that a genuine football kicking requires there to actually be a football there for you to kick. It doesn't. It's you can't secure your success in that all by yourself. So too, singular thinking is thinking that is designed so that it depends on the worldly presence of the object for success. And usually objects are there. Usually we're not hallucinating. And so we're pretty successful at this. But of course, we expose ourselves to the risk of error. And so the Russellian thought is to prevent us from even being exposed to that risk of error. And I don't see why you would necessarily want to do that. But that doesn't answer the question why I think that it's universal. But then it follows without too much trouble from the further idea that all of our thinking that is world-directed, at least, is thinking that attempts in this way to involve contingents, and so is at least potentially susceptible to this kind of risk and this kind of undermining. And I don't see any reason to once you've gotten your head around the idea that this risk is something that we take on and can take on, I don't see any deep reason why we should deny that we take it on all the time. Does that make some kind of sense? Or am I just an ape making noise?
I think I understand you. I think we're having thoughts. But
incidentally, that's one of the claims I made in my dissertation, I think, was that one of the reasons why philosophers are sometimes happy to imagine that maybe we never successfully communicate is because they're thinking about their own conversations. It's true that in philosophical conversations you might never be sure whether you're actually communicating with somebody, but this isn't the paradigm of conversations. And you'd only think that communication is really difficult if you took conversations like this as the paradigm of conversations, and they're not.
Right.
Anyway.
So your response basically is saying something like, it's okay if we have error sometimes.
Right.
That's a risk we should be willing to take. But I guess
and it's a risk we can take is the important thing. The important first point is that it's a risk we can take. And in particular, the risk of being undermined by, for instance, the fact that it turns out that I'm hallucinating is a risk I can take. My claim is that the alternative perspective is one on which that's not a risk I can take. I'm incapable of putting myself in that kind of semantic danger, so to speak, where it turns out that what I was saying was meaningless. So that's the line of thought that really strikes me, is that in a way the Evans style project is liberating. It gives us capacities that its opponents would deny us for fear of being undermined.
I see. Okay, actually, that makes sense. Okay, so let me actually now turn to what I wanted to ask you about fiction and fiction-directed thought. So first, let me just ask you, just to give a kind of broad introduction to what's at stake in this question about fiction-directed thought.
All right. So I mean, one of the things I just said, or you might have expected me to have said, is that singular thought is subject to existential generalization. You took logic. You remember a little bit of first order logic. So existential generalization is the rule that says that if Steve is happy, then someone is happy, right? So if Holmes is a detective, then someone is a detective. So it seems. But it doesn't follow from the fact that Holmes was a detective that someone was a detective, because Holmes didn't exist. Holmes, if you tally up all the existing detectives, you won't find Holmes there. So now it seems as if I want to say that Holmes-directed thought is dependent on the existence of Holmes, then I must be committed to the idea either that there is no Holmes-directed thought, or that somehow Holmes does exist after all. Neither of those is any good, because we do think successfully about Holmes, and we do, and Holmes doesn't exist. So I take to be obvious.
So actually, let me ask you something there.
So that's the problem.
Why not say something like Holmes does exist, but in a fictional realm or something
Sure.
like that?
I mean, you could, but I don't know why. That is to say, I don't know what fictional realms are. If if what you mean is just Holmes doesn't really exist, but we talk about him in fiction, then I agree. But if you mean something like, no, he really does exist, just not in the ordinary way, and you refuse to be pinned down on what you mean, then I think that you're being obfuscating. If you mean he exists in one of David Lewis's possible but non-actual worlds, then I think that that's a mistake for a different reason, but it's an interesting mistake because what I think is that Holmes doesn't need to have existed at all. And that is to say, I think that there's no problem with having impossible, for instance, fictional characters. And what it is to say that they're impossible is to say that there is no possible world in which they exist. Now, some people want to go so far as to say, well, then maybe there are impossible possible worlds. But it's, and at some point, I think that the metaphor of possible worlds gives out in its sort of theoretical utility here. And I think that one of the things that there are deep intellectual currents that push people to think that if it can't be cached in the talk of possible worlds, then it's no good. And I think that's a mistake, but that's for maybe a different conversation than this one. But the thing is that if I could invoke Holmes and his existence to explain my thought about Holmes, then I wouldn't have a problem about thinking about fiction. I would have a different problem, which would be the problem: how do I get latched on to Holmes in his fictional world? But that wouldn't be an especially pressing problem. That is to say that would be a problem for anybody who wants to think about fiction, but it wouldn't be especially pressing given the way I just framed my approach to things. But given the way I did just frame my approach to things, the fact saying that Holmes doesn't exist seems to put me in trouble because it seems as if that should mean that my Holmes-directed talk is undermined due to content failure. Right. And if that's right, then that's bad because, again, my Holmes-directed talk is not undermined due to content failure because you know exactly what I'm talking about. If I were to say that I have this crazy theory that Holmes is in fact a delusional psych patient and that Watson is his doctor helping him work through things, you would understand what I said and you would know that I was as nuts as I was claiming Holmes to be. Because that's a terrible reading of the text. Holmes was not a delusional psychiatric patient. He was in fact a detective. And I would be misreading if I were to say otherwise. So there's truth and falsity here. There's understanding and misunderstanding. There's all the rest of it. So all of that, I think, is just a constraint on how to think about fiction. And I think that the temptation to say things like, no, fictional characters do exist in some other realm, is to be explained by the idea that otherwise we wouldn't be able to explain how we managed to communicate about them. And that's a good intuition. It's not one I would criticize, but it hides the fact that the important question is, what are we doing when we're thinking about fiction? And it makes it seem, we're thinking about, say, Holmes. Well, how do you do that? After all, ordinary objects, if you want to know how you managed to think about like this book over here, we can explain relatively easily by invoking things like seeing it, touching it, being told about it. Those are all, well, and then, so that last one is the hint, right? But the way we manage to think about ordinary objects is by, first and foremost, by seeing and touching them. So we have an explanation, but it's them. And so the objects themselves figure in that explanation. By the same token, if I tell you about my partner, then she herself figures in some sense in the explanation of why you're thinking about it. How are you able to think about her and wonder who she is? Well, because I told you about her. I told you at least that she exists, right? So the question then, how to think about fictional characters, is along those same lines. How do I think about Holmes? Well, ultimately, it's because Conan Doyle told me about him. But there is still a problem because it seems to me that, again, there is nobody such that Conan Doyle told me about that person. That is to say, Holmes doesn't exist. And so that's why thinking about Holmes or thinking about fictional characters in general matters, is because we want to understand what kind of, so earlier I said that to be an object is to, for there to be an object is for there to be a certain kind of rule. And so the question then is, what kind of rules govern fiction-directed discourse? And according to me, the answer, once the question is put that way, the answer is relatively obvious. It's deference to a text, deference to what is going on in that text, where now what is going on in that text needs to be understood as what is going on in this make-believe text. But we know how to do that. We know how to engage in make-believe. We were talking earlier about the lava floor game or the mud pies game or whatever. So we know how to make believe, and we know how to make believe together. And so what we have to do, in effect, is make believe with Conan Doyle. And once we do, we know exactly what he's telling us. But fiction, in particular, involves a one-way path for make believe, right? I don't get to tell him. What I do doesn't affect the world of Holmes. Even if I write fan fiction, in writing fan fiction, I might invent a new game to play with Holmes, but I don't make it. If in my fan fiction Holmes is in fact a delusional psych patient, that doesn't make it so that you were wrong before to think I was crazy for saying that Holmes was a delusional psych patient. Oh no, look at my fan fiction. Here it is. Right. So what thinking about fiction carefully suggests, I think, is that is two things. One is it underlines the sort of normative structure of object involving language. Somebody who understands the Holmes text will not try to find Holmes himself. They might be interested in finding out who inspired Conan Doyle to write the Holmes text, but they will recognize that it's a bad question who is in fact Holmes. Historical evidence has a very different relationship to the interpretation of the Holmes texts than it does to our thinking on the basis of historical texts. If I go out and find other historical evidence, I might have reason to reject something that a history book says. But if I go out and find other historical evidence, I'll only have reason to criticize Conan Doyle for not being sufficiently careful. I won't have reason to say, oh no, Holmes didn't actually do that. I'll have reason to think that the Holmes story was not as good, not as historically accurate as I thought. So that's one crucial point, connected with the sort of meta-ontological concerns that we've been discussing. But the other, which goes back to the very beginning of our conversation concerning the relationship between thought and language, is that here we have a place where almost of necessity linguistic interactions make for thinkable content. It's because Conan Doyle wrote the things he did that I can think about Holmes. I think Russell again says somewhere in the introduction of mathematical philosophy, he says, if Shakespeare hadn't written Hamlet, nobody would have ever thought about him again. If nobody had ever thought about Napoleon, he would have made sure that they did. So Hamlet doesn't have a kind of self-standing status so that he could go around and make sure that we think about him, whereas Napoleon did. And that difference means that our thinking about Hamlet is intrinsically mediated by language in a way that our thinking about Napoleon, say, isn't. And so the role that language can play in sort of constituting the capacities for thought is, I think, really interesting here, because the fact that Conan Doyle wrote those books is what makes it possible for us to think about Holmes. And so some people have imagined that all we could ever really be thinking about then is not Holmes himself, but about, say, the texts. And I think that that's misunderstanding, or underestimating the sort of powers of language, because I think that linguistic interactions can put us in the position to think thoughts that we wouldn't have been able to think without the linguistic interactions. So, all right. Anyway.
So there's a lot there.
Yeah. Sorry about that. I got going.
No, but so, but I'm not quite clear as to your answer on the actual question of what it is that we're thinking about when we think about Holmes. Given that, you're committed to this environment dependence, right? So the object has to actually exist. So what is the actual object of thought about Holmes?
Yeah, no, so this is actually one of the reasons why I stopped being as happy with the phrase environment dependence. Because what I take to be crucial here is, so I would want to distinguish, let me back up. Earlier, I pointed out, when we were talking about shared hallucinations, I pointed out that one thing we could do is we could throw ourselves into a game of pretending as if there is a tree over there. I wonder if we can climb it. Oh, maybe don't know what to say. And we pretend that there's a tree. And in that case, where we both know what we're doing, it's clear enough what we are talking about. We're talking about a pretended tree. We're not talking about ideas. We're not talking about our hallucinations. We could instead be talking about our hallucinations, but instead we're talking about a pretended tree. But in the case where you're deceived by the hallucination, and so you're not throwing yourself into a game, you think you're saying something about a real tree, and so you're not saying anything at all, right? So this is an important contrast for me between what the person who's not deceived by the hallucination does, and she can do two things. She can talk about the hallucination itself, which exists. It's in whatever way that subjective states exist, she's having a hallucination. But the lime tree doesn't exist. But she could pretend it does. She could pretend, because she's having a lime tree hallucination, she could pretend that there's a lime tree. And when she does that, somebody else could join in the pretense and play along. That playing along is a kind of thinking that we do. And so it would be a mistake to say that my thought about Holmes is just like my thought about a real detective. On the contrary, my thought about Holmes is knowingly fiction-based. You can't have thought about Holmes. You can't be thinking about Holmes while thinking you're thinking about something real. In just the same way that you can't be engaged in that game about the lime tree if you think that you're talking about a real lime tree. You're not engaged in the game. Somebody might mistake you for being engaged in the game, but you're not. And so one of the reasons, like I said, why I'm hesitant to put too much on environment dependence is because that makes it seem really pressing how exactly I answer this question. What matters to me is that even this claim can be undermined. My claim that that I'm thinking about Holmes would be undermined if, in fact, Conan Doyle were writing a history and there were literal people that he was talking about, such that it would be appropriate to find historical evidence and say, no, Holmes didn't in fact do that. If Conan Doyle was trying to write a history, or if Conan Doyle really was Watson, say, and so there really was this was nonfiction, then there's a game to play. But it's not. But there's no such thing as thinking about Holmes as Conan Doyle wrote about him, unless you take Conan Doyle to be writing history. And now it's all getting a little bit convoluted because the counterfactuals are sort of overlapping in a way that's confusing. But my claim, and Evans didn't make this claim incidentally, but my claim is that in order to successfully think about fiction, you have to know that you're thinking about fiction. And so if you think you're thinking about fiction, when in fact there really is an object there, this is the sort of opposite case of the hallucination case. So you think you're hallucinating, but there really is an object. So you think you're playing a game, then you're not thinking about the actual object, right? So you're so at best you're playing a game, and you're not playing the game you think you are, because you think that you're subject to rules that Conan Doyle gives you, but that means you've misinterpreted them. And so, in a certain important sense, there aren't Conan Doyle given rules constraining your thinking, and so you're not doing what you think. You're not. You're to a much greater extent just playing around than you realize. If you were to pick up a history book and treat it like fiction, you wouldn't be seriously thinking about the world, and unless you were able to institute a game, as one does by writing fiction, unless you were to institute a game, that allowed us to treat it like fiction, you wouldn't really be thinking about a fictional world either. But one of the things that we do when we play around like that is we do, at least for the moment and at least in passing, create worlds that we can think about, and so create rule structures to play with. So in that sense, then, the account of fiction-directed thought is going to be parasitic on the account of world-directed thought. But it's also really important, and this is a part that we didn't talk about, but it's not maybe as crucial for these concerns. It's really important to me, though, that part of what it is to have the conceptual repertoire to be able to think world-directed thoughts is also to be able to use it playfully, to be able to pretend and to play pretend. And so what we're doing is we're fleshing out more about what it is to be in a position to think at all. And so part of what it is to be able to think is to be able to pretend. So yeah, does that? Am I getting closer to?
No, I think you answered my question. I mean, it sounds like, and tell me if I'm wrong, that the answer to the simple question of, what are fiction directed thoughts about is they're about a game of pretend, something like, what are the.
Well, no, they're made available by a game of pretend. And I'm sorry to be pedantic, but to say that they're made available to be by a game of pretend is different from to say that they're about that game. Just as to say that thinking about Napoleon is made available, for instance, by the various biographies of him. But to think about Napoleon, I don't have to be thinking about the biographies. But I do have to be sensitive to the rules that constrain whether the biographies are correct. I have to be sensitive to the rules of history, in effect. And when I'm thinking about Napoleon, I'm thinking in a way that is sensitive to the way that people are in the world. When I'm thinking about fictional characters, I'm thinking instead in deference to some particular text. And so the text plays a more constitutive role in the case of fictional characters. But nevertheless, the role the text plays is to make available thought about that character in particular. And so I'd be happy to say, in answer to the simple-minded question, what are you thinking about when you claim to be thinking about Holmes? The answer is you're thinking about Holmes. Who else would you be thinking about? But what that means is that fiction-directed thinking is different and needs to be treated differently and in parallel to world-directed thinking. And so in that sense, it's... but again, I wouldn't want to say it's an exemption to the strong Avensian thesis about singular thought, because there is a corresponding reflection. You have to, it's an achievement to be able to think about Holmes, just as it's an achievement to be able to think about that book over there. It's not something that one gets for free. In this case, one gets it from interaction with certain texts, whereas in that case, one gets it from interaction with the book itself. Holmes isn't available to be interacted with directly. So you can't think about Holmes in virtue of direct interaction with him.
So it's not an exemption, but there are different rules to how you deal with world-related thought as opposed to fiction-related thought. And in fiction-related thought, you can't actually have a thought about something that does not actually exist.
Can't have a thought. You can't have a world-directed thought about something that doesn't exist.
Right, but you can have a fiction.
Yeah, you can have fiction. You can have. Yeah, I mean, sort of the paradigm case of fiction-directed thoughts is thoughts about things that don't exist. Right. Right. I mean, I say that because it's complicated by the fact that, say, Napoleon can figure in my fiction, and so I might be thinking about Napoleon that he never would have acted the way he's shown acting in this novel, or something like that, right? And when I say that, I'm committed to the idea that it's Napoleon himself who's figuring in this novel, and so there are complications about how you handle characters going in and out. And similarly, I take it that there's a difference between saying that a character in one movie is inspired by a character in another movie, and on the one hand, and that the character in the second movie is the character from the first movie. There's a difference between inspiration relations and identity relations for fictional characters. And so there's lots of interesting things to think about there. But the idea is that there is a set of rules surrounding what it is to think about Holmes. And those rules involve ultimately some kind of deference to Conan Doyle's text, because he's Conan Doyle's character.
I'd like to ask you one more question.
Sure.
And it is, so one of the things that I've seen in this area of discourse is this issue of the fact that thoughts about fictional characters or events or whatever, and thoughts about real events or characters really have the same kind of content.
Right.
There's really no actual difference in understanding, a proposition about a fictional character or a real one. This process of understanding is the same. And then whether this happens to be true in a fictional world or in the actual world is just, some extra information, but it's not like crucial to understanding the proposition itself.
Right.
Yeah. What do you have to say about that?
All right. So there's two versions of the thought that you just described, both of which I would. So there's got to be something right about this. And so what's right is what I said earlier. It seems to me that to take the concept of a detective, if I'm right, if we assume that the concept that detective is the simple concept in the sense that it's acquired by interaction, roughly speaking, with detectives, then if I'm right, the radical thesis is that to think about detectives is to think about a way of being that is in fact instantiated in the world. The reason why we can think about detectives is because we got the concept of detectives from detectives themselves doing their detecting, and it's just the one concept. But one of the things that it is to have a concept is to be able to use it in a pretending way. Once I have the concept of a detective, I can now imagine someday I'll be a detective. Something I imagined a lot when I was a child. I can pretend to be a detective, right? Those abilities come, so to speak, for free. It's just the one cognitive ability to think about detectives. And it immediately allows for figuring in suppositional context, and in imaginary context, and in playful context. That was what I was saying earlier when I said that we're spelling out in more fine-grained detail what it is to have a cognitive ability. So part of what it is to be able to use it in other manners, not just to say things like so and so is or is not a detective. So if that's so that I agree with, and that's one of the things that seems to be at stake in the kind of claim that you were just making a moment ago. But now there's a further elaboration of the thought, which might be, look, and the claim that Holmes was a detective is the claim that somebody was a detective. You can understand that in just the way that you can understand it if I were to say I am a detective. Your understanding is just the same sort of claim. And they're both false. If you counted up all the detectives, you wouldn't find me and you wouldn't find Holmes. Right? So, having said all of that, then, what we have to say is, well, Holmes was a detective is false, but we treat it as true because we take it to be about the fictional world. And now notice we have two explanatory burdens. First of all, you have to tell me what you're doing when you're thinking about Holmes, and you can't invoke the fictional world because in the fictional world, it's true that Holmes is a detective. So you have to explain how I can understand the word Holmes without invoking fiction. And then you have to explain how I refer this not essentially fictional use of the word Holmes to the fictional world. And that doesn't strike me as, whereas for me, you don't understand Holmes if you don't understand thought about Holmes to be essentially playful. That is to say, to already be about Holmes in the fictional world. So there's no reason to claim that Holmes as a detective is first and foremost false. Now, a different alternative is that we could say, no, that's right. It's not that Holmes as a detective is first and foremost false. It's that in grasping the content, we don't yet refer it either to the real world or to the fictional world. But this cuts us from all of the explanatory resources I've been developing here, right? Because now you have to imagine that somehow we get thought content that it takes a further step even to refer it to the real world. And so we just have this thought content out there. Is it is Holmes real? Is he fictional? Who knows? And so the only way I can imagine that anybody could convince themselves of this situation is by thinking about these weird examples, examples like Robin Hood. You get this name Robin Hood. Is Robin Hood real? Well, turns out that people debate this, whether there was some Robin who is the source of the myths about Robin Hood. And so there are these names out there, and King Arthur is another one, right? And if you took those kinds of names as sort of the paradigm, then you would imagine that a full competence with names was consistent with ambivalence about the ontological standing of the bearer of the name. But I don't think that those should be taken to be the paradigm of names. I think that the paradigm use of names is cases like the one where your use of Michael is maybe not the best example in this case, since you had trouble remembering my name. The one that the names we have for people we know well. Those are paradigm uses of names, and for those kinds of cases, it would be bizarre to try to put yourself in a position where you imagine that like your mother was fictional, most the paradigm uses of names are world directed, and so we have an explanatory obligation to explain how we can acquire names that are fiction directed. But it seems to me that invoking the fact that we learn them in explicitly fictional contexts is helpful. And then we can understand these ambivalent names, these names that we use ambivalently, as specifically sort of agnostic. So when I use a name like Robin Hood, and I'm not throwing myself into the myths, and I say things like, I wonder whether there really was a Robin Hood, whether Robin Hood was real. I wonder what kind of evidence there is now. I'm using that name agnostically. And so that's a very stylized use of the name that it seems to me would be a mistake to build sort of into the center of a theory of names. So the basic truth underlying the thought that it's the same conceptual repertoire that explains our ability to think about the world and our ability to think about fictional characters. So we don't have a separate fiction detective. That's a concept. That's correct. But it doesn't follow from that there is some content that we grasp independent of our taking it to concern fiction. Part of what it is to think about Holmes is to be thinking about fiction. Why? Because Holmes is a fictional character. You shouldn't separate it out into two moments, the moment where you grasp the Holmes content and then the moment where you refer it to the fiction.
Right. Whether it's fictional or not is part of the content, is part of what you need to understand to be said to be understanding what's being said.
That's right.
Yeah. That makes sense. All right, Michael. I'm gonna leave it there.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun.
And that concludes today's episode of Who Shapes the Barber? Next week, I'll speak with Jody Azuni about his newest book, Ontology Without Borders. Again, I'm William Nava. You can check out other episodes, as well as my other philosophical and artistic work at williamnava.com. And if you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, go to williamnava.podbean.com. Thank you so much for listening.